Welcome back to Inside City Hall. American troops have officially left Afghanistan, and today President Biden marked a turbulent few months, which included the evacuation of over 100,000 people and the deaths of 13 service members, with a somber speech. This comes as attention is also being turned to where the refugees will end up, including potentially here in New York City. Joining me now for more on this is Washington, D.C. Bureau reporter Kevin Frey, joining us from the headquarters of the Department of Defense. Here with me in our New York studios is political reporter Emily No. Let's start with Kevin. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Errol. The president very much on the defensive this evening, basically saying, look, at the end of the day, this went decently well, as well as it could be considered, saying that he respectfully disagrees with those who suggest that the exit from Afghanistan, especially over the last couple of weeks, those chaotic scenes we saw playing out at the airport, well, those were just something that could not be avoided in some sense, saying in effect that if they had tried to leave the country sooner, months ahead of time, weeks ahead of time, and start those evacuations earlier, you would have already seen more of those sort of chaotic scenes at the airport regardless. Here's a little bit more of what he said, defending the decision to get out by this August 31st deadline, which they did succeed in doing.
I was not going to extend this forever war. And I was not extending a forever exit. The decision to end the military lift operations at Kabul airport was based on the unanimous recommendation of my civilian and military advisors, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the service chiefs, and the commanders in the field.
Now, as it stands, there are still some Americans, estimated in the low hundreds, still in Afghanistan at this time. Biden suggesting that, look, they're going to rely on diplomatic channels, switching away from military to diplomatic channels to try to help get those people out, suggesting that the Taliban, they have leverage against the Taliban to help make sure that those people are able to escape. At the end of the day, though, more than 120,000 people were evacuated as part of this airlift mission out of Afghanistan, close to 6,000 of them Americans. So on that front, Biden touting and praising the efforts of the military in doing so. At the same time, now this leaves this open question about what comes next for Afghanistan. In addition to those diplomatic efforts, what does this mean for intelligence, for security in that region going forward? Biden suggesting today we need to reorient our global worldview.
The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America. Not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow. That is the guiding principle behind my decisions about Afghanistan.
So that is the president now on the defensive. As I mentioned, though, he is facing criticism from all of this, including from some Democrats, also Republicans, some of them more conservative Republicans in the last day or so, calling for top Biden officials to resign or to be impeached. Errol?
So, Kevin, some of that we know from just the way politics goes is predictable and sort of manufactured outrage, right? I mean, some of the same people criticizing the president now were also calling for supporting the president and calling for him to get the troops out of what was called the forever war.
Right. I mean, and you have this kind of awkward line that some of these Republicans who really embraced the previous president, Donald Trump, who set up the timeline in some sense to try to remove the U.S. from their engagement in Afghanistan. Of course, when President Trump was lining that up, making that deal with the Taliban, that would have been a couple months ago that they would have exited. Biden ultimately pushed the deadline back a little bit, decided to continue with the process of moving forward. But ultimately, you have seen some Republicans who have criticized President Biden for not leaving sooner, now all of a sudden criticizing how we exited.
You know, Kevin, we should also keep in mind when the president and the Secretary of State yesterday talk about the remaining Americans there, while a lot of our viewers think that everybody's trying to get on the last plane out of there, these last few hundreds, in some cases, are dual passport holders, have a lot of family there, have made a very difficult personal decision, but are staying there because they think that's the right place to be right now.
Yeah, the White House suggesting that some of them, as you mentioned, kind of find that to be home for them. They might have businesses there. At the same time, the terminology you've seen used by administration officials has somewhat evolved over the past couple of days with, for example, Secretary Blinken suggesting outright that these are folks that want to come home. Others suggesting these are people that are kind of been indecisive or only wanting to leave in the last couple days. So it's a bit all across the board, but certainly the White House trying to frame this at the very least as these are folks that weren't necessarily ready to jump on the plane right away.
Okay, Kevin, stay right there. I want to bring Emily No in to talk about what the city and our state are doing to prepare for refugees, because some of them are arriving already, I believe, right? Good evening, Emily.
Good evening, Errol. We always knew that Afghan refugees would be heading our direction. We are, after all, a city of immigrants, including Afghans. But we learned a little more today about what capacity some may be arriving in. City and state and federal agencies are staging preparations at a cargo building at JFK Airport in preparation for a potential arrival of Afghan refugees at that site to potentially serve as a processing area and lodging, at least temporarily. The mayor was asked about this today at his daily briefing, and he had this to say.
Emergency Management Office was asked to work with federal and state officials on a contingency plan and to prepare a building just in case. What we're hearing right now, and of course all the decision making will be made by the federal government, all the key decisions will be made by the federal government, that they have not yet made a decision on whether they do need that building.
Port Authority also telling us that this is contingency preparation. The mayor had something interesting to say, I found, which is that he'd be welcoming immigrants, but in a quote, taking our fair share. The congressional aides, community leaders, so many New Yorkers have for weeks now been fielding frantic texts, DMs from strangers and loved ones alike who want to get out of the country, who have been left behind. We've been in touch, of course, with Congresswoman Grace Meng's office, who has a pretty large Afghan immigrant community in her district. She said, I stand ready to personally welcome Afghans as they arrive here in New York. Our entire city and state must welcome them with open arms. She was speaking in particular to those Afghan allies of ours who risked their lives to save American lives when they are in Afghanistan. And she did add that her offices will be continuing to work with those who are desperately trying to leave Afghanistan as the United States shifts from that combat stage of operations to a more diplomatic one. Errol?
Right. So if family reunification is anywhere in the considerations of the federal government, a fair number of them will probably end up here in New York City.
Right, and that's almost a certainty that a fair number of them will end up in New York City, sponsored by their family members. If indeed they've entered the country, and some already have through Dulles Airport, they were likely processed using as humanitarian parolees, and they would need to apply for asylum. They would need family members to put in petitions for them if they want to stay longer, if they want to qualify for some of the social services that legal refugees or legal asylees are entitled to. So it would be a process, and they would be hopefully ultimately reunited with family members here in New York.
Governor Hochul has even talked about wanting folks in some of the smaller towns upstate that could use some population. We've been down this road before, where a number of refugees really helped revitalize parts of upstate New York.
Right, and this is what some Afghan-American community groups, particularly in Buffalo, where Governor Hochul is from, have been saying that we should be welcoming these refugees with open arms. They boost population numbers in some of these economically depleted areas upstate, and they will help the economy in the end.
Okay, Kevin Frey, is that going to be the next big political fight? Where do the refugees end up? Because there are, 50 states. There are plenty of communities that would love to have them, but there are plenty of politicians who might want to make some hay by fighting against the process for one reason or another.
Well, let's start even before you get to the where do they go part of this conversation. You already have many Republicans, many might be an overstatement, a lot of Republicans at this point coming out and raising concerns about having these refugees come to the United States, wanting to make sure they're vetted and so forth. The Biden administration has made efforts to try to mitigate those concerns, suggesting they are going through these multiple processes to get through the refugee process. But you also then have some conservative Republicans throwing in this whole argument about the southern border being open. So the debate is very much raging, and the Republicans have embraced it. You have seen some Democrats pushing back, saying, this is what America is all about.